Hey, welcome to a video analysis of The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. And this analysis has two purposes. One is to show The Road Not Taken as a model for a journey poem, kind of a classic example of it, because that's going to be the first creative poetry assignment you have in this unit. And secondly, to use this analysis as a reminder of Bernie's 5 steps to understanding poetry, an easy, straightforward way to get into a poem. All right, so let's do it. All right, so I'm going to click off myself here and take you through this. So I pulled up The Road Not Taken. Actually, I pulled it up from the website of the Poetry Foundation, which is a great place to find definitive versions of poems. You can search by poem or poet at the top. You can also sometimes get an audio version of the poem, although I prefer my video reading that you'll see on Classroom. They also sometimes, for famous poems like this one, they have maybe a poem guide, which gives you more information than you'll ever need to know. This is actually Poetry Foundation is a local organization. They were the publishers, and they are the publishers of Poetry Magazine. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. So let's go through The Road Not Taken. Now, the first thing I want to do is sort of defend this as a journey poem. And the journey poem is kind of a type of poem that I just made up. Basically, the definition, it's a poem about a rite of passage, about a key transition in your life, a coming of age transition when you went from being a child to an adult. And it's a poem about that, but it's through a metaphor of transportation or movement. And I think the classic journey poem, the entire poem is an extended metaphor. So on one level, it's just about an actual physical journey, right? But on a second metaphorical level, it's actually about a emotional, mental, spiritual journey that you go through at sort of a key moment in your youth. All right. So, and The Road Not Taken, I think I would say is one of the classic examples of this. It is, on one level, a poem about someone going for a hike. But I think it's pretty clear that it's someone who is going through a moment in their life where they have to make a critical decision about how they're going to live their life. And so it works on both a physical level, but also on that metaphorical level. And so, where do I get that from? Well, let's just read the first stanza, right? The two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So that's just the start. But you already get a sense. It's this critical moment there. The speaker has come to a fork in the road, right? And they see two different paths ahead of them. All right. So before we go too deep into this, let's just remind ourselves of Bernie's 5 steps to understanding poetry. Step 1, who is the speaker? Step 2, who is the audience? Step 3, what is the occasion or situation when the speaker is speaking to that audience? And then the last 2 are the what of the poem and the how of the poem. What is the meaning of the poem? And how does the language of the poem kind of enhance and expand that meaning? How does the poem use multidimensional language to get at that meaning? And so, this is the classic worksheet here if you like this, but I'm going to do this through the graphic organizer that I also have. They're identical, the worksheet and the graphic organizer, just they put things in different ways. The graphic organizer kind of takes you through it step by step visually a little bit. So let's do that. So, all right. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this with the title of the poem, The Road Not Taken. And the poet is Robert Frost. Oops, sorry. There. Robert Frost. And so the speaker of the poem, right? And we're not talking about the poet themselves. We're saying who is actually saying the words in the poem. And in particular, who's the I of this poem? And the easy thing is to say the author, the poet, but we want to leave room for the poet to speak in a persona, like through the voice of another person. So we just want to talk about what from the poem itself. What can we determine about the speaker? And we can't determine a lot about the speaker, but the speaker of the poem is, on a literal level, is someone who is out for a hike in the woods. But on a metaphorical level, someone who is approaching a critical decision in their life. Okay. And I think that's what we can get from the poem itself. The audience for the speaker here in the poem, is, I don't know, it's one of those ones where is not specified, right? Or is a personal reflection. It's kind of like the speaker themselves, right? And the occasion of the poem, we kind of already have that here, right? Is again, on the literal level is, a hike in the woods, a critical moment in life, right? All right. So moving down, we have the what of the poem here. And then, for the how of the poem, the way I break it down in this worksheet is basically, can you give me 3 examples of how the language enhances the meaning? Now, if you're actually doing a full analysis of this, you'd want to, talk about all the key sections of the poem. But here, you're just talking about how does some of the language add to the meaning, right? And so we're going to hold off on the what of the poem. And let's just talk about some of the lines that are really powerful, right? So going back to the poem here. So what I think is really cool, and you might not notice it, is the first more than half of the poem is one sentence. This is one sentence. And it's kind of a meandering sentence here. And I think this sentence gets at the complexity of the poem, kind of the multi-layered nature of the poem. So we already talked about how he comes to a fork, I say he, the speaker comes to a fork in the road here, or in the trail, and they have an option, right? And he looks down one path, and he saw it bending in the undergrowth. And what he means there is that the grass was already stepped on, so it was bent, right? And then he takes the other one. He doesn't take that one, and he says, as just as fair and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. So unlike the first one that he looked at, this one doesn't seem to have anyone having stepped upon it, right? It's grassy and wanted wear, wanted being sort of lacked or didn't have wear, or didn't have sort of something worn on it, right? And so that is the setup, right, for this decision, right? And now that's, complex enough. I took the path which looked like no one had taken before. But then, before this sentence is completed, there's another qualifier, though, as for the passing there, had warned them really about the same. So he's saying, once I actually walk on this second path, or the other way, all of a sudden it becomes just like the first one. I have made it into one that has already been traveled, right? And so he thinks once he's walked down the road, both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black, right? So, in the end, not a lot of people have walked on them, but people have walked on them. So it's kind of interesting. It both talks about how he takes one because it seemed a little bit less traveled, but he's realizing that in the end, that makes it traveled, right? We'll get to that in a little bit, right? But I would just, in my analysis here, let me go to my one here. I would say, I would mention the first long sentence here, right? And I wouldn't necessarily even need to repeat the line. I mean, I could do that. So from 2 roads to trodden black, right? 2 roads trodden black. And I would say this line is an example of, and I would say, I'm going to give it a adjective, meandering syntax. Because it mirrors because it goes on and on. I was going to say, and so if I go down a little bit further, I'll say the syntax mirrors the back and forth attitude of the speaker, and it reveals the complexity of the poem's meaning, its view of taking, the road not taken. And we'll get to that in a second when we talk about the meaning there in a second. What other striking line might we talk about here? There's a lot of ones. I want to get to the last one here in a second, right? But I'm going to say, I'm going to talk about the tone here of these 2 lines, the shifting tone. I'm going to copy these lines here. You can copy them right there. And I'm going to put them as our striking lines right here. Don't have line numbers here, so no big deal. I'm going to put them in here, and because I'm a neat freak, I am going to make this a little bit extended so all of these words can be on one line, right? That there, right? So these are 3 lines there. I kept the first for another day, right? So we're back to saying, basically saying like I took the second path, but I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. So what I'm going to talk about here is the line is an example of the shifting tone in the poem. Well, why is it a shifting tone? Because the author initially is excited about a chance to take a different path, but then is resigned to the fact that, it probably won't happen. And the reason why, I could even extend this a little bit to make it look a little bit nicer here, because I'm a neat freak on my things as well. And the reason I say this is because he says, I kept the first for another day. You get that sort of exclamation point, which sort of talks about his excitement. Like, next time I'll take the other way and see what that would lead to, right? But then he says, yet knowing how way leads on to way, right? Once you take the path one direction, right, then you come to maybe another fork in the road and you take another direction. You're not going to be able to get back to that initial moment when you made that initial decision. It's just not probably going to happen. So I doubted if I should ever come back. Way leads on to way. One thing leads to another, and you can't get back to the original moment, right? And I think that's really interesting because, again, the poem's doing 2 things. One is why this decision is really important, and it's about, the freedom to choose. But then it's kind of like, no, once you make a choice, it kind of sets in a cause and effect sort of chain of events that you kind of lose your ability to choose. It's a really back and forth here. So I guess that goes into the explanation. And I think sort of the shifting tone reflects the complex attitude toward choice. Yes, a person can choose a path, but once on it, it's hard to get off. I'm just going to sort of say that as well. All right. So let me do another line here. So we got just to get a third line as well. And again, notice I haven't touched upon the how yet, but I haven't touched upon the what yet, but I have a kind of a what in the back of my mind, right? As I'm doing this, I already talked a little bit about sort of the metaphorical nature of things. So one more example here really quickly. I mean, I love this final stanza. It's kind of famous. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And what I want to do is talk about this line break and kind of repetition too, right? And so let me put this in here as a line. Whoops. And get this sort of, so this one, this is the end of a line. And I took the one less traveled by, right? And so this is an example of, both repetition, of I and a powerful line break because it, let me just do this here, it breaks the line at a key moment before the final realization. I should say this really quickly. For Robert Frost, right, this poem, and Robert Frost in general, he's kind of an example. I think most people would put him in the modernist camp of poetry, which was a dominant type of poetry in the first half of the 20th century. And in a lot of ways, he has a modernist attitude, and we'll talk about that later. But he also has a very traditional sense of form, and he has rhyme and rhythm of sort of an old-fashioned poet. Modernists tended to be kind of experimental sometimes with form, and he's not so experimental with form, although his content has a real modern sensibility. In any case, it's a pretty structured poem in terms of rhyme and rhythm, and so and I and by do rhyme with each other, right? But this break is sort of a break in the rhythm of it too. And yes, he has a lot of ways in which he ends lines just because he's trying to rhyme. But in here, he rhymes, but he also breaks in a way. And this, I think the key here, right, is that he is both hesitating and coming to a conclusion, right? And so he realizes that, well, I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. But what difference has it made, right? So I would just say sort of the repetition and line break emphasize the hesitation and contempt and complex thinking of the speaker. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. But let's go back to the meaning here, right? After looking at the poem that way, I think that, this one of those poems that people have argued about for a long time. So I'm just going to end this. I'm just going to try to articulate the what of the poem. But I think you could, definitely open up a discussion and an argument about this. But I would say one way to say would be is that the early decisions a person makes in life are critical. They determine the future path that a life will take, one which is hard to alter. The taking a path that appears unique can lead to great possibility, but very few paths are actually permanently unique as well. So I could go on here as well, but I'm trying to state sort of the theme and meaning of the poem, right? And the key here, without going sort of too in depth into it, is that this poem is actually just about a hike in the woods, right? But it's actually about something much bigger, right? All right. I've already bored you too much, but here's an example of a complete sort of quick poetry analysis. Again, not a complete poetry analysis in terms of like analyzing the whole poem. I only analyzed 3 particular lines, but complete in terms of what we're doing in class, just to get a taste of it. And enjoy reading a journey poem like The Road Not Taken, and writing your own journey poem as well.